Hello, I'm Martha Minow, and this is the fifth in the series of sessions for the COVID-19 and the Law Colloquium here at Harvard Law School. I give thanks to John Manning and many members of the Harvard Law School community for making possible this colloquium. The session is recorded and will be posted. This recording will be posted on our website. The link is available in the chat. Emily Broadleib and I developed this as a forum for discussion of the many ways in which legal rules and practices are tested and are responding to the challenges brought on by COVID-19. It gives us a chance to examine how the pandemic shines a spotlight on inequities, frailties, failures, system-wide in legal frameworks and institutions, especially the burdens that fall hardest on marginalized communities, notably people of color, people in poverty, and there are also inequities that have to do with geography. There are also opportunities, and we will be exploring some of those today. Over the course of this fall, the colloquium has been addressing topics ranging from basic needs and government duties, the economy, finance and the law, legal rights, the needs of people in detention, innovation, access to justice. We also have been very lucky to have participation with over 40 members of the Harvard Law School staff and faculty. Prior sessions on food systems, healthcare, drug development, housing, and elections, the recordings are available. Upcoming sessions on labor and employment, duty of care by employers, consumer protection law and finance, people facing detention in criminal law and immigration, and also access to courts, legal innovation, agriculture, environmental issues, and more. Today, we address the very critical questions about education and disinformation. I'll say a word about that, but first want to give thanks to Evelyn and others at HLS, including a group of teaching fellows, notably Bridget Slater here today helping us with the questions. When you have a question at any time, you can post it in the Q&A, use the Q&A tab. Education and disinformation are not the same subject for sure, but they have connections. COVID-19 has caused enormous disruption in schooling. Here we are on Zoom, but it's especially disruptive for children going to school, kindergarten through high school. It disrupts their learning, whether they're able to go in person or hybrid or all remote. And it's incredibly disruptive for the families, the parents who become teachers and monitors, juggling work or other duties. And it is particularly challenging for children with special needs. We could not have a better speaker on this subject than Michael Gregory, who's clinical professor of law. And as part of the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative at Harvard Law School, a partnership with the Massachusetts Advocates for Children, he teaches rights and studies education and is in the trenches as well as developing great new ideas. The issue of education underscores our reliance on tech infrastructure right now, which is tragically missing for way too many people. And on that and related issues, we're incredibly lucky to have Susan Crawford, the John A. Reilly Clinical Professor of Law here at Harvard Law School and author of books on the telecom industry, on data smart governance, on the US and tech developments. She served as special assistant to the president for science and technology and innovation policy and advised 2 New York mayors on technology and broadband. She will raise the issues, the challenges, and the possibilities, and also draw on her expertise on class and racial divisions in cities, including one in South Carolina. The issues of information and disinformation are surrounding us about COVID in particular, but also about politics and more. And the information that adults need is our education. And so that's why we're so lucky today to have Evelyn Douek, who is a lecturer here at Harvard Law School and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and a global expert on the issues of comparative free speech law and theory, a blogger, a tweeter, and astute commentator on social media. First, we turn to Mike Gregory. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Minow. Good to be with everyone today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Susan and Evelyn. I thought what I would do is just start by quickly summarizing two things. Number one, the work that my colleagues and I have been doing during this time that gives us a perspective on what families and students are encountering in schools and districts, particularly here in Massachusetts. And then secondly, to a really brief overview of what I see as some of the big challenges and opportunities of this moment for education. So first, the work that we've been doing, most importantly, is with our own clients in the Education Law Clinic at Harvard Law School, representing families of students with disabilities and making sure that their federal and state entitlement to a free, appropriate public education is being provided during this time. Secondly, I've convened a coalition of all of the legal services attorneys in Massachusetts who do education work, and we've been meeting bi-weekly since school closures began. And so both hearing from them about their clients as well as everything that they're hearing organizationally through their intakes gives us a sense of what's going on out there in communities. Along with those colleagues, we have throughout the pandemic convened listening and learning sessions with wraparound service providers that work very closely with Medicaid eligible families in Massachusetts and who accompany families to meetings at the school and help them self-advocate for their students' needs. And so we've been learning from them. We've also conducted over the summer a series of Zoom interviews with high school students with whom the clinic had been previously advocating prior to the pandemic, and focused our conversations with them on three questions. One, what were their feelings about what remote learning was like in the spring and how it did or didn't meet their needs? Secondly, what is it like to be a high school student in this moment when the movement for racial justice is intensifying and spreading across our country? And what do students need their schools to be doing for them to help them engage with this during this time? And finally, what were their concerns and suggestions for fall reopening and what schooling should look like when it resumed this past month? And then finally, we have non-lawyer colleagues on our team who have been working directly with educators who have been trying to adapt to this moment. And so we've been learning from exemplary schools and districts about how they've been responding. So from all of this work, what have we learned? And this gets to the challenges and opportunities. I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing is just the intensified inequities that students and families are encountering. And so what are some of the vectors of inequality that we're seeing as particularly salient? Professor Minow mentioned students with special needs or disabilities. And certainly those students are some who have been particularly harmed by the lack of regular learning during this time. Also, language access is a major barrier for many families if English is not their first language. Technology, which I know we'll hear more about from Professor Crawford. Not only the hardware and devices and access to those things, but also internet connectivity. And even if you have those things, if you don't have the knowledge or the experience using this hardware and knowing how to connect to the internet, the devices aren't necessarily of great use to you. The financial resources that families have and what their work arrangements are directly impact remote learning. If your parent is working during the day because they're an essential worker and not there to help you log on as a first grader, or we've seen a lot of students who are with their grandparents during the day, for example, who may have less experience using technology than parents do. This is a major theme that we've heard about in all of our work. Age of the student. What it means to be learning remotely as a 15-year-old is very different than what it means to be trying to log on as a 5-year-old. And so the developmental consequences of remote learning have been great. And then cutting through all of these inequities is race and culture and the disparate nature in which these other inequities are falling on families of color. So what do all of these things add up to? I think a tremendous risk that the connection and engagement that families and students are feeling to one of our most important civic institutions is really under threat. From a combination of both students either not being able to access or simply disengaging from their learning, as well as a growing pressure of punitive responses that schools are using, both through school discipline, through referrals to the juvenile court, and through referrals to child protection agencies. We're seeing lack of engagement in remote learning being addressed through punitive responses rather than through reaching out and forming connections with families. And so those are the challenges. What are the opportunities? If we choose to do so, and here's where one of the readings that we made available to all of you speaks to this, the reading from the Washington Post about really refocusing on what's most important in schooling, and that providing community, a sense of relationship and connection, the precise thing that's being threatened because of the remote nature of learning, could actually serve as a call to revision what the foundation for academic success can be. And so I don't know that we've really taken up that opportunity quite yet, but I think the opportunity still remains to refocus on safety, connection, community, belongingness as the foundation for everything that school is supposed to provide. So I'll conclude my summary there and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mike. And as a parent of a new school attendee, you have firsthand knowledge as well. We turn now to Susan Crawford.
Well, thanks, Mike. And I really appreciate your on-the-ground expertise with these children and families. I'm just going to underscore one thing that Mike mentioned. To be livable, a house in the United States has to be served with water and electricity. Every house in the United States should also have a persistent, cheap, world-class connection to the internet, but they don't. We think about half of Americans don't. And of the many overlapping, horrifying realities of the COVID crisis, this is one I've been focused on for quite a while. Suddenly, as we all went home, we noticed that 30% of homes in San Francisco couldn't get their kids online to be educated. Numbers go way up. San Antonio, 70%, 54% in Laredo, Texas, 40% in Baltimore, 80% or more on tribal lands. We are underserved and overcharged as a country, and the long-term life effects that Mike is spelling out will be profound for us as a nation. Now, law got us into this fix. Law can get us out of this fix. But in order to change anything, you need three elements. You need a crisis, leadership, and a willingness to change. We've certainly got the crisis, but I really don't see either of the other two, leadership or willingness to change. I'm going to sketch three things very quickly. The demographic facts, just so you all have them, the market structure as it exists in the United States, and the absence of a road forward. Unlike Mike, I think today I'm not feeling optimistic that we're going to change this anytime soon, in particular because the people who are running for president are all pretty much allied with this state of the world. So having a sufficient connection at home is highly correlated with socioeconomic status. We know that a third or less of people earning $25,000 a year or less have a connection at home, where 90% of people earning $150,000 or more do. The numbers across all income levels are much lower for Black and Hispanic students. Tragically, this is the word Mike used, and he's right, only about 60% of low-income K-12 students are regularly logging into online instruction. But 90% of high-income students do. And in schools that are serving predominantly Black and Hispanic students, just 60 to 70% are logging in regularly. Now, as Mike says, there may be several reasons for this. Low quality online learning could be boring. No quiet rooms, no time, no devices, a separate issue, but that's a big one for poor people, and parental supervision, Mike mentioned. But necessary, but not sufficient, is this persistent, cheap connection. About 3 years ago, someone I'd interviewed from Malaysia said that this amounted to child abuse in the United States. And I remember the bark of laughter I gave to that. No, that's overstatement. But I think we're actually getting to that point now when it comes to education. Earning power, ability to find well-paying jobs, long-term GDP losses, dignity, all of this is being harmed here. By high speed, I mean a symmetrical connection. That means you get to upload, participate, speak, as well as consume of 100 megabits per second. so that someone in your household can be doing this video chat, maybe someone's streaming a movie, maybe someone's playing video games, so that capacity is not a limit on what you want to do to thrive as a human being. Our data is pretty bad on this, but the best thought is that we have about 157 million people in America don't use the internet at anything approaching high speeds. Even though cheap, fantastic access is the norm in places like South Korea, New Zealand, by the way, places that have managed the virus much better than we have. There are big gaps in urban and rural service in rural areas, often not available at all, or very expensive, and many urban people of color can't afford to subscribe. Nearly 1 in 5 African Americans does not have a wire at home. Now you could say, oh, they're relying on their smartphones, but that's a separate complementary with an E market. The data caps on wireless subscriptions amount to about 1/40 of what you would do using a wired connection with Wi-Fi at home. So if you're trying to go to the doctor, educate your kids, all of that over a smartphone, you'll be assessed enormous overcharges by the companies that provide that service. So really pretty bad demographic facts out there in line with everything else we're seeing in America. Market structure. All you need to know is that we deregulated this entire thing in 2004. We assumed that competition would protect Americans, that all these companies would battle it out with each other and we'd get low prices and great service as a result. But this is a very high cost infrastructure thing, and these companies are sensible, they're not evil. And so without oversight, what they did was to divide markets. So the phone companies left the wired market, went into wireless. Verizon and AT&T are all wireless. And the cable guys grabbed the metro markets and have complete monopolies there, local monopolies. And they also consolidated. So Comcast and Charter are both enormous. They each have 30 million households under their wings. And the wireless market is entirely separate. So they can charge whatever they want. And no one is saying anything about it at the moment. And if you're looking for a optimistic market story, if you're feeling like you want to invest in something, buy cable. The first 2 quarters of 2020 saw 2.4 million people sign up for internet access, and they all went to cable. So Charter alone got 850,000 new customers and is doing extremely well. They will be looking for subsidization from the federal government to go into rural areas, but there we'll be providing a monopoly service that many people can't afford. We should be looking the rest of the world in the rearview mirror when it comes to public health, when it comes to internet access, but we are an also-ran, and this is having major destabilizing effects on the country, in my view. There is a little bit of money from the CARES Act. It was spent on buying products of the existing incumbents and not changing any of this structure. And of course, the new bill is not going anywhere. So we have no plan to change this at the moment. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that very sobering comment. I know that people who are relying on their phones often have minutes that really curb their ability to use it, certainly not all day for school. When we circle back to questions, maybe you can tell us more about what some cities and communities have done that's more optimistic. Well, for access to information, for those who have it, the internet is unparalleled, but it also is posing new issues of disinformation. Evelyn.
Thank you. I am used to being the most dystopian person on a panel, and I really have my work cut out for me today. So thank you for that, Michael and Susan. Okay, so I have been tasked with talking about disinformation. The context in which this occurs, of course, is that you may remember at the start of the pandemic, when the pandemic was declared, the World Health Organization also declared this thing called an infodemic, which is an appropriately scary name for the sheer glut of information that we experienced and have been experiencing. Some of it really important and useful, and a lot of it positively harmful, and a lot of it somewhere in between. So what about the law? That is notionally what this panel is about, and there have been a bunch of countries that have enacted specific laws to deal with this situation, 44 by one count. But you know, in the United States, of course, there is the First Amendment, which would make such such a law tricky, unconstitutional, even if there was political will. And a lot of human rights experts sort of generally counsel against this kind of approach, such as a special rapporteur on freedom of expression that, you know, talk about censorship being not only dangerous, but also eroding public support for the necessary sacrifices that people have to make in such a context. So this also accords with sort of the research that has been done around people's way of processing information in the context of crises. So Professor Starbird has been doing a lot of really wonderful work around this, and she talks about this process of collective sense making that happens in the context of high uncertainty and anxiety, which is where people are just like talking to each other, they're hungry for information, they spread rumors, they are trying to make sense of what's going on around them, and that sort of really contributes to this this atmosphere of the infodemic, but is also in part an important part of informational and psychological coping with what's going on. And so what do we do about this, about walking this line between the fact that, you know, there is just too much that we need to engage in this kind of process, but also that obviously disinformation has real world consequences, and in the context of a health crisis, like positively harmful and catastrophic effects for people. So the best advice, the best research is to focus on the sort of the high level influencers and the people who are trying to exploit this for personal or reputational gain, rather than, you know, the average person and the individual pieces of content in general. So where this has played out most obviously, and where my research focuses, is on the social media platforms, who generally have wide immunities and can do whatever they like in terms of content. And they, at the start of the pandemic, declared a state of emergency, like many other authorities, and they took 3 exceptional measures. The first is that they worked really hard with authoritative sources of information like the World Health Organization to connect people to information and put up health panels that you may have seen at the top of your Facebook feed if you still use Facebook. But they also took some things that, for people that have watched this space, did really seem exceptional, because they often insist on not being arbiters of truth. And they said, no, in this situation, because of the context, we will police misinformation aggressively. We will take stuff down where it is a threat to imminent physical harm. But because they had to send a lot of their workforce home for the same reasons as the rest of us are currently on Zoom and at home, they had to use their artificial intelligence tools more than normal to enforce. So they rolled out these very big, long policies about the kind of stuff that they would be taking down. This really was, for a bunch of us watching this space, quite unusual, and they were relying on authoritative sources of information. They're not going to decide what is harmful or not. They would rely on places like the World Health Organization. And then they talked about how they would use their AI tools, but they noted that AI tools are blunt and they don't have access to context, and so they're going to make more mistakes than they normally do. But in the context of the pandemic, that seemed like a reasonable choice. The other thing they did was they partner with fact checkers, and this is a chart from the First Draft, which is a non-profit that works on disinformation and misinformation. There have been, in the last 6 months, nearly 10,000 fact checks. For the first one was on January 15th in the Philippines. And that has been the course of the fact checks that has happened over the last 6 months. What are the results? Well, Facebook says it's removed over 7 million posts and labeled 98 million as of June. Twitter says it has, as of July, had removed nearly 15,000 tweets and challenged 4.5 million accounts. We have no idea how many labels they've applied. And what has YouTube done? I don't know, a lot, they say. Definitely just trust us, we're doing stuff. We have literally no idea. So these sound like big numbers. That sounds like they're doing things, but we have absolutely no idea what they mean. They're not broken down by language or region. And history tells us that if they are doing okay in English, they are doing, and that's an if, we don't know, they're doing much worse in other languages, for sure. So that is a key inequity here. There's no independent verification of these numbers. They tell us and we have to trust them. There's no information on accuracy rates or how much was missed. Okay, they took down 7 million and they labeled 98 million. What about the other 200 million or however much it was? We have no idea. And we know that they did make mistakes. So a key one that people may have heard about, this video pandemic that went viral on social media, that it had conspiracy theories about the source of the virus, including Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates, and then positively harmful claims about the fact that wearing masks would hurt the wearer. Obviously not true. That bottom blue line is Taylor Swift. Now she does very well on social media, and that top pink line is pandemic. So lots of people saw this. We also know that the AI tools did make the mistakes that they said they were going to make. So when they were enforcing a mask ad ban for people that were trying to exploit people's panic and sell masks, it hampered volunteer mask makers, and other stuff it just missed. So we do know that there are mistakes. We know that these figures aren't right, but we don't know how much in either direction they're right or wrong. And also, as an important theme of this symposium, there are always disparate impacts in this area, and this shines a light on them. The pandemic has shone a light on them as it has in so many other areas. And I commend to you a report that's available on the website in the readings by Brandy Collins-Dexter of the Shorenstein Center here at Harvard about the disparate impacts in Black communities that is exacerbated by inequities, by all of the things we've talked about today, by distrust, warranted historical distrust of health authorities and law enforcement authorities that makes all of these impacts of disinformation and misinformation more pernicious. And that's a report on Black communities, but I'm sure there are many other marginalized communities for whom this is also true. To be fair, this is hard. A small dot of sympathy for tech platforms. Authoritative sources of information have been wrong and slow. The classic case here is masks, and when they don't want to be arbiters of truth and they say they will rely on authoritative sources and those authoritative sources don't step up, it does pose a really tricky problem for them. And of course, the elephant in the room is just this week, the president had his tweet censored by Twitter and taken down by Facebook, where he claimed that that COVID just wasn't that bad, no worse than the flu, and a study out of Cornell last week saying that the single largest driver of misinformation and disinformation in the context of the pandemic is the president. So it does mean that proposals like this one from some senators to establish a task force for coordinating government's analysis and response to false and misleading information would be a little bit like the government pointing at the government going, you are the source of misinformation. And so it's, it does really present a unique challenge. What do we do about this? I really think we need an infodemic commission. We need to open up these companies. We need to know what went on so that we can learn about it for next time. And one of the reasons why I think this is a good topic for a panel is I think that obviously education is just going to be such a crucial part of trying to combat these issues in the future. And with that, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And I think we now have some rivals for who's most dystopic, but very important for us to see. I wonder if you each could address this question. What mix of legal tools or money would make a short-term difference in the problem you're describing and a long-term difference in the problem you're describing? So who'd like to speak to that? Mike?
So that's an interesting question because what we've been advocating for most during this time is a focus on more engagement with families, better communication, taking time. In Massachusetts, they delayed the start of the school year by 10 days or more. And we were so hopeful that what educators would do during that time is just really reach out to every family and figure out how to talk to them, figure out what's the best time of day, the best method for communicating with them. That's the foundation for everything that parent's going to be expected to do to support their child's learning at home. That doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money. It certainly could be a policy focus that didn't turn out to materialize, although we were advocating for it. But I think building the kind of community and connection that we were calling for before the pandemic and that we've only intensified our calls for certainly can be supported with some resources, but it's more like a difference in mindset. putting more money toward it isn't necessarily going to change the mindset. It's like we need the different mindset to kind of redeploy the resources that we already have. So that makes it a harder question to get policymakers to focus on in some way, because we tend to gravitate toward the resources, which are important, but not the whole picture.
Very valuable. Susan?
Well, by contrast, infrastructure really is all about money and time. Short term, the incumbent carriers have been given money and encouraged to make inexpensive products available to low-income people. Problem is that long-term, they view those subscriptions as customer acquisition opportunities. So that will end, and then the people who really can't live without it will just pay whatever it takes, stop buying food in order to have that internet access connection. So this really is a long-term structural problem that does require money, would require probably about $100 billion, which in the big scheme of things, not that much, to make sure that what's called open access basic infrastructure touches every home and business in the United States. And the government itself is not selling internet access, but building highways for retail operators to sell internet access across. So in Wilson, North Carolina today, if you're in public housing, you pay $10 a month for the kind of fiber access subscription that they usually only have in Sweden and South Korea. That's because the city believes it has a public service mission to make internet access available on a competitive basis. But no other city in North Carolina is allowed to do that because Time Warner passed a bill outlawing city involvement in internet infrastructure. So a lot of moving parts in the infrastructure story, but it really is about patient capital, pension funds, other government guarantees that lower the cost of capital, only investing in publicly overseen open access infrastructure. And that's the basic move that would change the entire picture here.
You mentioned fiber. Can you just tell people who are not familiar, what is that?
Well, there are only 3 wires to know about. It's like a fairy tale. Our telephone wire was copper, and that's pretty much out of business now when it comes to internet access. Any of you relying on DSL know that. That's just trying to squeeze more capacity out of a copper wire. The middle wire is what the cable operators use, called hybrid fiber coaxial. It's a shared connection at the neighborhood level and very much prefers downloading to uploading. And because it's shared, often runs out of capacity when you're trying to do what you're want to do at 7 o'clock at night with your neighbors. And then the world-class infrastructure, which is what we should have in this last bit of the network between, let's say, a neighborhood node and your house, is fiber optic, extraordinarily clear glass through which light is sent rather than electronics. And that we have fiber all over the country between cities and between continents, but that very last bit of the telecom network is throttled by monopoly players who have no interest in updating to what is the standard infrastructure in the rest of the world.
The last mile problem.
Yeah.
Evelyn, money, law, short-term, long-term.
I'm happy to be a Goldilocks between the two and say I want both, please. So I think in the short term there is some stuff that money really could do. I think that the fact checkers are just completely outgunned, and there's not enough support and resources for fact checking organizations around the world, in particular in other countries and in other languages. That's very much the case, but everywhere that's true. And I don't need to tell you, Professor Minow, about the importance of supporting local media, and I think that's a huge part of this as well, that sources of information that are close to the communities that they are reporting on are especially important, and in building trust as well about the advice that people should be paying attention to, and when they issue corrections for disinformation and misinformation, they're more likely to be trusted when they're close to the ground. But long term, fixing the media ecosystem is going to need law and antitrust, and I think also this Infodemic Commission, which I would really like. Transparency is not going to happen voluntarily. These companies are not going to tell us what went on unless we crack them open with some blunt force tools. And I also think, as part of that process, we need to know more about what works. We actually don't know very much about what helps people process information. If censorship, has its perils, what works in terms of issuing the best corrections and connecting people to trusted information. And that's an area where we need more transparency, more experimentation. We need the data, and we're not going to get that without legal tools, I don't think.
So Evelyn, as between trying to get the companies to take down bad stuff versus highlighting reliable information, how is it going on those two fronts, and which one would you push on?
So I think we need both. I think that the biggest part of their push has been the connecting people to authoritative information, and I think that has been. I think that's really important and really valuable. I don't have the numbers here, but millions and millions of people have been connected to World Health Organization resources as a result of their efforts, and I do think that that's really important. And I think there are categories of information that just need to come down. That's obviously really, really harmful, but there are gray areas where that kind of censorship, and in the context of the pandemic, there are lots of stories around, for example, the masks. Where there was a time where the authoritative sources of information were saying masks are harmful, and they reversed, but actually that authoritative source was so far behind the scientific consensus. And if the social media companies were continuing to take that information down while the World Health Organization was still saying that masks were not the recommended course, that's obviously a problem. But at the same time, who are these tech companies to decide what is the best response to a pandemic? And so I do think that there is a real issue there in terms of those approaches. So I think we need both. And the other thing I think that one of the things that they can do, which we don't talk enough about, is like content neutral, like friction. Like, there is no reason why a video like Plandemic needs to be seen so quickly by so many people. If they just sort of introduced a tripwire for stuff to go viral before it spreads so fast, that could be really, really valuable as well.
Can I ask Mike a question?
Please.
Yeah, I was so interested, Mike, when you said you talked to high schoolers about what it was like for them. What was it like for them? I said there might be an issue with low quality online learning. What happened?
It was pretty low quality online learning. I think what they said most sort of universally was, and these were high school students, of course, that what they really missed was a sense that they had a connection to their teachers, that they wanted to know that their teachers cared about them, that the teachers wanted to know how they were doing. There was very little live synchronous instruction that was happening, at least in the spring, and we spoke to these students over the summer. Presumably, there should be more of that going on now, at least in Massachusetts. There's more clear mandates from the state about what structured learning opportunities should look like remotely now that school is reopening. But what they wanted was connections to their teachers and connections to their peers. And that was what they felt that they weren't getting. You know, there were assignments put up on a Google Classroom or something, or emailed out by the teacher, a lot of independent work, but none of the back and forth that happens in live instruction. And so, you know, they did their best to muddle through, but they wanted that connection. They wanted that community.
Not to mention the peer involvement. I'm going to have an individual question for each of you, and I'm also going to ask each of you about the issue of trust, which Evelyn brought up. The issue of distrust about tech companies, about information and internet, about schools, about teachers, about unions. I fear is growing and not getting smaller. And so I'm going to ask each of you about that. But first, individual questions for each of you. So for Mike, what about the options for parents who are essential workers and can't be home and may not have a home situation where there's someone else who can be in charge? Are schools obliged? Are they capable of doing something? Should there be in physical spaces for some of those kids? What's your sense about that?
Sure, and maybe one way to illustrate that is just by sort of sharing the story of a family that we're working with right now. which is sort of a very typical example where dad is working full time from home, but has a job where he can't stop what he's doing in the middle of the day to help with remote learning. Mom does not work. She's home during the day, but there are two siblings in the household, one of whom, because of all of the anxiety and stress related to this moment and other things, has been hospitalized. And so mom is on the phone with doctors all during the day. This is a psychiatric hospitalization, leaving the second grader with autism on the Chromebook without anybody to sit beside him and help him engage in learning. Mom says, you know, on the best day, in the best moment when she's sitting right there by his side, maybe 15 minutes tops of attentional capacity at a given moment, but certainly not the 5 or 5.5 hours that students are now expected to be engaged in structured learning time throughout the day. So what are the options that this family has? Thankfully, with the beginning of this school year, our Department of Early Education and Care in Massachusetts has developed a program for organizations like the YMCA and others to welcome students to come into the agency and engage in remote learning with some adult supervision that is not their parent. So there's a modicum of structure and relief for parents who need to spend time during the day doing other things, whether it's working or in this instance, you know, tending to the care of another child. Many parents have simply had to stop working. I have another client who was furloughed from her job, which was not something that she wanted initially, but as remote learning unfolded, she realized even as she was being called back, she couldn't go back to work because her son wouldn't be able to learn without her there to help him. And so she faced the really hard choice of, when they call me back, do I go back or stay home and risk never being called back again and losing my job? So parents are facing those choices. We have a number of families where it is older siblings who are trying to do their own remote learning and also keep their younger sibling logged in and learning as well. So it's sort of a catch as catch can, but a lot of really impossible choices that families are facing.
Well, thank you for that. I remind our webinar attendees, you can ask a question in the chat. My question to Susan is, you have spent a lot of time in South Carolina, and can you give us a picture of both how it is dealing with the access to technology issue, but also how the inequities and inequalities are playing out during this pandemic?
Well, having spent so much time on internet infrastructure, I was looking for things that were a bit more visible. And so I've actually been studying rising sea levels in Charleston and the intersection of that with race. And it's actually indicative of every other part of unfairness you want to talk about in South Carolina. Public education in South Carolina, particularly around the Charleston County area, is completely segregated at very low quality, mostly Black schools getting no help from funding or better resources. It is a nightmare of a public school system, and no plan, as far as I can tell, to make it any better. Because the water is so visible, people have got to notice that the poor, low-lying Black areas of the Charleston Peninsula flood all the time with fetid, horrifying water. But even though they're seeing that, they're still not acting. So there's a tremendous attachment to the status quo that I see in Charleston. At the same time, youngsters, our students, age and a little bit older, are very interested in change, both Black and white people, and are gathering data about exactly what's happening and presenting it to the public. Now it's up to the public to decide to change how things happen in South Carolina. There is some appetite for that, but right now what I'm seeing is that everything's of a piece: the status quo, the appeal of private profit, the sort of romance with private property, and a reluctance to fund public anything, education, anything else, is leading to a pretty horrifying situation there.
You mentioned public. I can't help but think about how the public-private divide is affecting communities in the school context in particular. Yeah. So people with means are sending their kids to private schools, most of which are, that I know, are meeting in person in one way or another. Many have rented extra space to make that possible, and to have small pods and so forth. And what a explicit and visible demonstration of difference. Evelyn, question, yesterday was a big tech day in the United States. So there's both a House Judiciary Committee report on antitrust. You mentioned antitrust. Is that a tool that will more usefully produce some accountability for the social media players. The president, who was back on Twitter, tweeted that we should eliminate the immunity for the platform companies for liabilities that are faced by other kinds of publishers and so forth. So I just wonder, can you give us some window on to whether even during this pandemic, we may see some big legal change? And what do you think about those two particular issues?
Yeah, and then after all of that as well, Facebook took, unprecedented action against conspiracy theorists by QAnon. It's every day there's a million stories about this kind of stuff at the moment, and with the repeal 230 was what the president tweeted. That is in large part as well directed at, there's a hearing with the tech CEOs on October 28 about Section 230, and there is, I'm sure that part of that, or my understanding of that, is that this is, supposed to be hanging over their heads with every decision that they make in the coming weeks about what they do with content on their platforms. So I think, there is real mobilization around legal reform in these areas, for sure, and that is bipartisan. That no one likes the tech companies, so we can all agree on that at least. We don't have agreement on what to do about it, and so it's unclear what's going to come out in the wash. I personally am in favor of antitrust action, but I don't think it's going to solve our disinformation problems or our trust problems. Even if you break Facebook up from Instagram and WhatsApp, you still have Facebook, and that is huge and has a lot of disinformation and misinformation on it, and that's not going to be solved through antitrust alone. As to 230, everyone nobody likes it, but everyone everyone has the 230 grievance of their own, and dislikes it in different ways.
Saying what it is, this is the immunity shield provided by the Communications Decency Act for the platform companies.
Right, exactly, so that they can't be sued for content that other people post on their websites. And so that is in part intended to incentivize them to moderate, to do the kinds of things like label posts, to take things down, to get their hands dirty, and rather not just be dumb pipes. So, again, there's definitely going to be, I think it's on the chopping block, or it's going to be reform in the next few years, which is a remarkable thing to say, that has gone from off the wall to on the wall extremely quickly, but it's really very unclear what will come out of the process.
So I planted the question about trust, and I'm going to circle to Susan first. You are in and around the tech world. You're in and around many worlds, including just watching how government works and doesn't work. This is a heightened period of distrust. What will it take to restore trust? Does law have any role? Is there trust of any legal institution or any public institution at this moment?
Well, I'm running a reading group this fall called Look Both Ways, How Democrats Helped Republicans Dismantle America, because we're all in this together. And one of the scariest comments I got from a Harvard student just a couple of years ago was, why do we need government at all? Couldn't the private sector just do everything? And, I went to public high school. My dad benefited from the GI Bill. I come from the 70s where there was this idea that people were going to have a thriving life, basically, and that the private sector would sort of be on top of that. And it is that loss of that ideal that government has any real role to play in our lives, which for me has eroded our ability to make progress as a society. So how to change that, it's a big move, and frankly, we didn't do it perfectly the other times we've tried convulsively to reestablish government in America. The New Deal was intensely racist, but at least there was an idea that Congress had a role to play, president was going to do something, and the courts could by and large be trusted. For me, the essential ingredient is actually leadership. Someone showing up who cares more about the country than herself or himself, and cares more about everybody thriving than the particular short-term profits of the enormous companies that are at the moment having a great sway over policy in the United States.
It is true that there's higher trust of local as opposed to national government. And And maybe there's a way to build on that. But Mike, at this moment, there's a lot of distrust around schools.
There is, and I'm glad you asked this question about trust, because I think it relates directly to some of what I've been saying about the need for connectivity and the need for relationships at the local level in schools, and the collective sense making that Evelyn spoke about. I mean, school is a place where, one of the places where that kind of thing happens. And because of the lack of consistent communication, the lack of transparency that's leading to this mistrust that so many families have of schools right now, and that for certain families certainly preceded the pandemic. We're at risk of endangering, as I said before, you know, this connection. I mean, what other institution than schools do a great number of people have a long-term intimate relationship with, both as students and then later on as parents? It is the place. School is the institution that at least has the opportunity to bring us all together. And so if parents are losing trust in schools, that's really, really scary.
And you put your hope on the individual relationships, but are there union barriers to requiring teachers to do the outreach, or other kinds of obstacles for what look like very sensible efforts?
You know, one of the groups that was way out in front on this was the Boston Teachers Union, and they invested a lot of time and a lot of effort at the very beginning of the pandemic to do a whole training institute where they had Boston educators convening, doing role plays with the script about how do you place that first call to the family and ask them how they're doing and figure out what they need. So, so the unions actually, and in terms of some of the things that I'm talking about, not all of them, have actually, you know, been in the vanguard, not standing in the way. Of course, what has been another inequity, one that I didn't mention, but I think you did, is the geographic one. You know, in Massachusetts, each town has its collective bargaining agreement. And so what's been possible in terms of in-person learning has varied greatly from town to town, and even some very, you know, well-resourced towns, but with union difficulties, have experienced somewhat less access to education than in neighboring communities because of unions. So it cuts both ways.
Well, Evelyn, you raised trust in the first place, and you've been talking about it. I'm wondering, what is your understanding of the relationship between social media on the one hand and the most watched media source in the country, which is Fox News? Isn't Fox News a bigger jeopardy for misinformation, especially around COVID? And what, if anything, can the social media outlets do in relationship to it?
I think this is just such an important question. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we talk about, as I have done for the last 50 minutes, talk about social media in isolation from the rest of the information ecosystem, because it is only one small part of that entire information ecosystem. And, you know, on that count, I highly recommend a report out of the Berkman Klein Center by Professor Yochai Benkler et al. Just last week, about voting disinformation in this context, but I'm sure it applies more broadly. There's just focused on voting misinformation, which showed that, yeah, the social media is secondary. The disinformation disseminated through Fox News and through Breitbart and through mainstream media and through the president appearing on everyone's screens is far bigger driver of people's belief in these false claims about voting than social media. And, you know, another example is the tweet that I put, or the tweet very similar to the one that I put up. We have like lots of news stories about that. At the same time, the president releases a video of him arriving back at the White House where he made many similar claims about don't be afraid of the coronavirus and things like that. And it appears across all, you know, all the mainstream media outlets and things as well. So we do, it is definitely a big challenge of what to do about disinformation that happens in the press, but we can't sort of forget that huge part of this puzzle when we're talking about disinformation and misinformation.
Thank you. I have another question really for all of you, which is whether this is a time when there could be innovation in the spaces that you're writing about. Not only could there be, but is there? And what would it take to promote innovation? You know, people say necessity is the mother of innovation. Is that true, and can that be true now?
Well, I'll start with that one. This particular issue that I'm talking about, the infrastructure, has an exact parallel in this history of electrification. When electricity was absolutely a private cabal controlled by a few companies, 90% of farmers didn't have it, very expensive in urban areas. And at that moment, cities and rural cooperatives rose up and said, we're not going to be held back by these private electrical companies, and built networks for electricity and provided cheap service, transformed the country, and eventually shamed the federal government into acting. So there are already more than 900 cities in the United States that are trying to fix this horrendous internet access problem on their own. And it's tough, but they're slogging away and they are scrappy. And I see that innovation all over the country every day. It's moving too slowly for reporters to capture, but it's actually quite exciting. And in the long scheme of things will make a big difference.
Super. Mike?
Yeah, I can give one example. So I think process is a place where there can be a lot of innovation. And I think this has been a moment where what families have wanted more than anything else is a say in what school is going to be, and a chance to voice their concerns, raise their questions. And that's what so many of them haven't had. But I saw one example through this whole time of a district here in Massachusetts that used something that I had never heard of before called Thought Exchange, which is an app or a website. It's a way of getting people to exchange thoughts, and then there's some sort of algorithm for letting people comment on each other's thoughts in a way to kind of come to a consensus about things that the school district should be doing. Surely that's not a panacea, but it was an impulse in a direction that I really appreciated. And in talking with parents who participated in that, even if the school district ultimately didn't enact all the policies that they wanted, they felt that they had been engaged in a process, that they had gotten to have their say, and they felt a part of a community through doing that. I think more things like that are the innovations that can help continue to forge these connections between families and schools.
One similar innovation that I have heard about is, building better connections between the formal school and the after school. And the informal education has been long a goal for many, many people. And this period is really forcing people to be creative about that. Evelyn, innovation?
Yeah, so this is great because it gives me the chance to be the most pessimistic again on the panel, because I don't see a lot of innovation in this space, which is crazy. So in one sense we're dealing with very old problems here, hundreds of years of what do we do with false speech, and rumors in the context of disaster and emergency are not new. These are not new problems, and we haven't had solutions to them for hundreds of years. In another sense, of course, there are a bunch of new problems created by the new technology and our new information ecosystem. But on that front, I just don't see a lot of incentive for innovation, because these tech companies that by all accounts, they're doing fantastic. The pandemic has been great for them. We are all stuck inside and online and using their services more than ever. And so the innovations that they're coming up with are tinkering around the edges of like, well, let's make this label a little bit bigger and maybe a different color. And like that's gonna solve everything. And I think we need to be thinking much more like structural reforms and systemic reforms if we really want to tackle this problem. We're not going to tackle it piece of content by piece of content. And so, that is where things like antitrust and systemic reform coming through the law are really going to be necessary, because it's just not going to come from those companies in any meaningful sense by themselves.
Thank you. A connection that ties together each of you is the possibility of greater education about critical media use, being more informed and skeptical about what people read and know. So in the few minutes that remain, do you have a sentence each about what's promising there, what could be done, or if you want to be pessimistic, you can do that too.
I've learned across my career that people with very different beliefs sharing a screen with agreed on facts can actually come to consensus. And for me, the graphical network screen is actually an opportunity for enormous growth and change in this country. So I'm going to be optimistic about that. There's something about, just as Mike was talking about the brainstorming platform, sharing a resource can bring about real change and cooperation.
When you're all on the same side of the screen, there aren't polarizations.
I'm going to do an optimistic one too, which is listening to young people. They're the ones who are going to teach us about how to critically engage with media and literacy. It doesn't have to be the other way around. So I put my trust in them.
Terrific. Evelyn?
I'm happy to be able to end on a bit of an optimistic note as well. In my work, I talk to a lot of reporters on the disinformation beat who are tracking this stuff and keeping track of it online and seeing what goes viral and things like that. And they tell me that people are getting better and they are more aware of the fact that there is a lot of disinformation and misinformation online and that they need to be more careful, and that there is a lot more critical thinking happening in those spaces, and that they have seen a marked improvement over the last couple of years alone. And I think that's really promising. I do think that education is going to be a huge plank of what happens here, and we're kind of just adjusting to this new world, and they say we are making progress.
Fantastic. You are a wonderful panel. I send thanks to each of you and to Bridget Slater, who's helped us behind the scenes, and Ellie Vinay. And let's go and innovate and find more grounds for optimism. These are crucial elements for finding our way back to trust. And thanks again. Thank you all for attending.